Epistle to the Romans, Volume 2, Session 45，羅馬人書註釋第二卷第45講。我哋講到羅馬書第12章第16節㗎，我哋再讀第16節，要彼此同心，不要志氣高大，倒要俯就卑微的人，或者係倒要俯就卑微的事，不要自以為聰明。我哋上次講到呢度嘅 ，There's a question whether the lowly refer to things or persons。解經家嘅意見係分歧嘅，究竟卑微係指卑微嘅人，定係卑微嘅事呢 ？Expositors are divided. It is more likely that the former is correct。大概呢係卑微嘅事係保羅嘅意思 ，because of the contrast with high things。因為呢度所對照嘅係高位嘅事情 ，high things。If this is the intent, then the thought is that we are to be content with a lowly state and with humble tasks。假如呢個係保羅嘅用意呢，咁佢嘅意思就係話呢，我哋要滿足於一個卑微嘅地位同埋一啲卑微嘅任務㗎。我哋讀緊呢個經文 ，Philippians 4:11，腓立比書第4章第11節。我並不是因缺乏說這話，我無論在什麼境況都可以知足，這是我已經學會了。1 Timothy 6:8-9， 提摩太前書第6章8同埋9節嘅，只要有衣有食就當知足。但那些想要發財的人就陷在迷惑、落在網羅和許多無知有害的私慾裏，叫人沉在敗壞和滅亡之中。Hebrews 13:5， 希伯來書第13章第5節。你們又忘了那勸你們如同勸兒子的話，說：我兒，你不可輕看主的管教，被他責備的時候，也不可灰心。我哋要以卑微嘅地位同埋卑微嘅事為滿足㗎。好，我哋而家繼續講。The term rendered condescend means to be carried with。俯就呢個字嘅意思呢，就係被承載着咁嘅意思㗎。我哋參考啲經文 ，refer to Galatians 2:13 and 2 Peter 3:17。我哋睇經文，加拉太書第2章第13節。呢度講到保羅責備彼得，其餘的猶太人也都隨着他裝假，甚至巴拿巴也隨夥裝假。2 Peter chapter 3:17， 彼得後書第3章17節。親愛的弟兄們，你們既然預先知道這事，就當防備，恐怕被惡人的錯謬誘惑，就從自己堅固的地步上墜落。嗰個字本身係被承載着被跟着去啦。And indicates that our feelings and attitudes are to be so much in line with lowly things that we shall be perfectly at home with these circumstances。嘅意思就係話呢，我哋嘅感情同埋態度應該與卑微嘅事係咁貼近呢。喺呢啲處境裏邊，我哋應該好自如嘅，好自然先啱嘅。If the lowly refers to persons， 卑微假如係指卑微嘅人呢， then the thought is that we are to be at home with humble folk。佢意思就係話呢，我哋應該與卑微嘅人好自然嘅去相處嘅。Whatever the denotation of lowly may be， 不論卑微係指人或者係指事 ，the practical import would include both lines of thought。實際上意義係一樣㗎 ，for the one would imply the other， 因為佢哋彼此暗示㗎。The vice against which the exhortations are directed is a common one。 and gnaws at the root of that community in the Church of Christ on which the Apostle lays so much emphasis。呢啲嘅勸告呢，係針對一種好常常見到嘅惡習，佢係腐蝕着教會裏邊嘅彼此合一，而且保羅係非常強調教會嘅合一㗎。There is to be no aristocracy in the church, no cliques of the wealthy as over against the poor。教會裏邊唔可以有貴族，富有嘅唔可以結黨，唔可以忽略貧窮㗎。No pedestals of unapproachable dignity for those on a high social and economic strata, or for those who are in office in the church。社會裏邊上流人士喺教會唔係高人一等嘅，唔係話唔可以接近㗎。教會裏邊有職位嘅，亦都係如此。1 Peter 5:3， 彼得前書5章第3節，也不是轄制所託付你們的，乃是作群羊的榜樣，作群羊嘅榜樣。How contradictory to all such pretension is the character of the church's head。呢種嘅傲慢同教會嘅元首基督嘅心態係何等嘅矛盾呢？ I am meek and lowly of heart。 Matthew 11:29， 馬太福音11章29節，耶穌話：我心裏柔和謙卑。Be not wise in your own conceits。 不要自以為聰明。英文係不要驕傲以為聰明。Literally rendered, it is be not wise in your own eyes。 直接翻譯嘅意思就係話唔好驕傲喺你眼中以為自己聰明。Refer to 11:25 and Proverbs 3:7。 參考羅馬書11章25節，箴言3章27節，不可倚靠自己的聰明。Apparently, the conceit in view is that sufficiency, by which our own judgment is so highly esteemed that we will not have regard to wisdom that comes from any other source。 呢處嘅傲慢係指我哋對自己有咁高嘅自我評估，以致呢唔會尊敬任何從外來嘅智慧。It strikes at the opinionated person who has no regard for anyone else's judgment。呢度係針對嗰啲主觀性好強嘅人，唔願意考慮別人嘅任何判斷㗎。The wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated. James 3:17。 從上頭來的智慧，先是清潔或者係純潔，後是和平、溫良柔順，滿有憐憫，多結善果，沒有偏見。英文翻譯為係容易接受勸告，沒有假冒。雅各書3章第17節。The opinionated person is intractable and impervious to any advice but his own。 主觀性強嘅人呢，係唔接受別人勸告嘅，只顧自己嘅意見，唔理睬別人嘅勸導。Just as there is to be no social aristocracy in the church, so there is to be no intellectual autocrat。 正如教會裏邊唔可以有任何所謂上流人士，亦都唔可以有思想上嘅獨裁者嘅。Romans 12:17-21， 我哋嚟到羅馬書第12章第17節到第21節。羅馬書12章17到21節，不要以惡報惡，眾人以為美的事要留心去做，若是能行，總要盡力與眾人和睦。親愛的弟兄，不要自己申冤，寧可讓步，聽憑主怒。因為經上記着，主說：申冤在我，我必報應。所以你的仇敵若餓了，就給他吃；若渴了，就給他喝。因為你這樣行，就是把炭火堆在他的頭上。你不可為惡所勝，反要以善勝惡。Misunderstanding of these admonitions arises from failure to see that they are concerned with our private, individual, personal relations to one another and not with magisterial and judicial administration. 呢啲嘅勸告往往係被誤解嘅，因為冇睇到呢係論到個別私人嘅人際關係，唔係講到政府同埋政府嘅執法㗎。It is noteworthy that the apostle proceeds immediately after these admonitions to deal with the prerogatives and functions of the magistrate, and therefore with civil, judicial, and penal institution. 好值得注意嘅就係話呢，保羅講完呢啲嘅勸告嘅話之後呢，馬上就討論到政府官員嘅權利同埋功能。換言之，討論到民事、法律同埋懲戒方面嘅制度㗎。To the magistrate is given the power of the sword to avenge the evildoer, refer to 13 verse 4. 民官係被賦予佩劍嘅權利，為行惡嘅人執行報應嘅。參考羅馬書13章第4節。If he avenges wrongdoing, he inflicts the evil of penalty. 咁樣做，即係執行報應嘅時候呢，就牽涉到實施懲罰㗎，即係以惡報惡㗎。So for the governing authorities not to render evil for evil and not execute wrath, chapter 13, 2, 5, and 6, would mean abdication of the prerogative and obligation devolving upon them by God's appointment. 因此呢，政府當權者假如唔係以惡報惡，冇施行到憤怒嘅話呢，13章2、5同埋6節，咁呢喺上帝指派佢哋要使用嘅權利上就棄權，喺實行佢哋義務上係失責㗎。It is necessary, therefore, to appreciate the difference between what belongs to political jurisprudence and that which is proper in private relationships with our fellow men. 因此必須要區別政府範圍嘅準則同埋人際關係之間嘅準則㗎。To transfer the prohibition and injunctions of the respective spheres would be not only distortion, but perversion, and would lead to the gravest travesties. 假如將一個範圍裏邊嘅命令同埋禁止轉移到另外一個範圍呢，唔單止係扭曲，更加係罪惡，會帶來荒謬嘅歪曲㗎。Here is an appropriate example of the need of observing the universe of discourse in the interpretation and application of each part of Scripture. 呢一處又說明喺解釋同埋應用每一段經文嘅時候呢，必須係注意到討論嘅範圍嘅 universe of discourse. Render to no man evil for evil， 不要以惡報惡。This is the negative complement of what we found positively in verse 14. 呢個係負面嘅說法，與第14節正面嘅論述呢係對稱嘅。It serves to point up the relevance of this admonition, to observe that it applies in our individual relations even to the crimes which are subject to penalty by the civil magistrate. 呢個勸告係適切嘅，請注意到係與我哋人際關係有關係嘅。就算有人犯罪，應當受到民官嘅懲罰嘅時候，我哋喺人際關係應該點樣做？ We may not, as private citizens, take upon ourselves the execution of the demands of justice in the sphere of government. 我哋作為公民呢，係唔可以擅自執行政府範圍裏邊嘅公義㗎。Avenge not yourselves, beloved, verse 19, 第19節，親愛的，不要自己申冤。The essence of the exhortation is, however, that we may never indulge in vindictive retaliation. 不過呢度勸告嘅核心意義就係話呢，我哋任何時候都唔可以報復㗎。Refer to 1 Thessalonians 5:15 and then 1 Peter 3:9. 我哋參考帖撒羅尼迦前書第5章15節。你們要謹慎，無論是誰都不可以惡報惡，或是彼此扶持，或是待眾人，常要追求良善。 than 1 Peter 3:9。然後彼得前書第3章第9節，不以惡報惡，以辱罵還辱罵，倒要祝福，因你們是為此蒙召，好叫你們承受福氣。The next appeal does not, as the AV might suggest, refer to honesty in our relations to men, although this is an important ingredient in what is commended. 下一個勸告呢，就唔係好似英文 AV 所暗示嘅，指着我哋與別人嘅關係必須誠實，雖然呢個係重要嘅要素。The appeal is to take thought for things honorable in the sight of all men. 保羅嘅呼籲嘅意思就係話呢，要注意嗰啲喺眾人眼中看為尊貴嘅事情。For the first time in this chapter, this type of consideration appears, namely, the need for maintaining a deportment that approves itself to men. 喺第12章，保羅就這裏係第一次作呢方面嘅考慮嘅，就係話行事為人必須配得別人嘅稱讚。The close parallel, we take thought for things honorable not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. 2 Corinthians 8:21 points up this consideration, because emphasis falls upon the necessity of taking care for what is honorable in the sight of men, in addition to the Lord's approbation. 哥林多後書第8章21節有個平衡嘅經文嘅，我哋要留心行光明的事，不但在主面前，就在人面前也是這樣。就指出呢方面嘅考慮嘅重點就係話呢，不僅行事為人要得到主嘅稱讚，亦都喺人面前係尊貴嘅。Elsewhere, Paul speaks of commending himself to every conscience of men in the sight of God. 2 Corinthians 4:2， 保羅將佢自己推薦俾眾人。哥林多後書第4章第2節，在上帝面前把自己薦與各人的良心。He also requires that a bishop must have a good report from those who are without. 1 Timothy 3:7。保羅亦都要求呢，作監督的必須在教外有好名聲。提摩太前書3章第7節。All men in our text must include, therefore, those outside the church. 喺呢節各人呢，當然係指嗰啲喺教會以外嘅人咁。This reminds us that the norms of behavior governing Christian conduct are norms that even unbelievers recognize as worthy of approval. 呢度保羅提醒我哋，管理基督徒行為嘅原則呢，係連非信徒都認為係值得推崇㗎。And that when Christians violate these canons, they bring reproach upon the name of Christ and upon their own profession. 所以當基督徒違反呢啲準則嘅時候，佢哋使基督嘅名受到羞辱，自己所承認嘅信仰亦都係受到羞辱㗎。This does not mean that the unbelieving world prescribes norms of conduct for the Christian. 呢度並不意味着不信嘅世界或者世人呢，係為基督徒嘅行為釐定準則㗎，唔係咁嘅意思。But only that the Christian, in proving what is the good, the acceptable, and perfect will of God, must have regard to what can be vindicated as honorable in the forum of man's judgment. 只不過話係呢，當基督徒察驗何為善良可喜悅，即係蒙上帝接納上帝嘅完全旨意嘅時候，必須要考慮到呢啲準則面對世人嘅判斷或者論壇是否可以被證實係尊貴嘅呢？ We may never overlook the effect of the work of the Lord written on the hearts of all men, chapter 2, verse 15, as also how alert the unbelieving are to inconsistency in the witness of believers. 我哋絕不可以忽略喺人類嘅心裏邊所寫下嘅律法嘅行為或者功用。羅馬書2章15節，仲有非信徒對基督徒嘅見證的不一致性呢，係多麼的敏感㗎。If it be possible, as much as in you lieth, be at peace with all men. 若是能行，總要盡力與眾人和睦。This must be as inclusive in its scope as the preceding clause. There is no restrictive use of the expression all men. 範圍係與上一個從句一樣咁廣㗎，眾人唔係合意㗎。It is obvious, however, that a reservation is made in this instance with respecting the obligation to be at peace. 但係好明顯嘅，呢度保持和睦嘅責任呢係有所保留㗎。If it be possible， 若是能行 indicates it may not always be possible， 就指出呢有時候係不可行㗎。We may not suppose that the implied impossibility has in view any inability arising from our weakness, as, for example, inability to restrain our own impulses of anger or resentment. 有時係不能行，但呢度所指嘅不可行呢，係唔可以包括因為自己嘅軟弱而不能行，不能控制自己嘅衝動啊、怒氣啊、苦毒所導致嘅不可行㗎。The impossibility is that of another character。呢所指嘅不能行係唔同性質㗎。It's a case of the objective impossibility, chiefly where truth, right, and duty command resistance。係一種客觀嘅不可能性，主要係指當真理、正直同埋責任要求基督徒必須抗拒嘅時候。It would violate witness of Jesus to demand peace at the expense of these priorities。假如追求和睦而妥協咗呢啲嘅優先考慮呢，係違反主耶穌嘅話語㗎。我哋參考一啲嘅經文 ，Matthew chapter 10 verse 34 to 36，馬太福音第10章34到36節。你們不要想我來是叫地上太平，我來並不是叫地上太平，乃是叫地上動刀兵。因為我來是叫人與父親生疏，女兒與母親生疏，媳婦與婆婆生疏。人的仇敵就是自己家裏的人。Also Luke chapter 12 verses 51 to 53，還有路加福音12章51到53節。你們以為我來是叫地上太平嗎？我告訴你們，不是，乃是叫人紛爭。從今以後，一家5個人將要紛爭，3個人和2個人紛爭，2個人和3個人相爭。父親和兒子相爭，兒子和父親相爭，母親和女兒相爭，女兒和母親相爭，婆婆和媳婦相爭，媳婦和婆婆相爭。As Philippi again observes， 正如解經家腓力比再一次嘅指出 ，side of speaking the truth in love, must ever stand loving in truth。佢話除咗用愛心説誠實話、説真理，另外亦都必須用真理或者誠實嚟堅守愛心㗎。As much as in you lieth， 總要盡力。我哋下一次開始講呢方面，我哋下次繼續。